You're about to hear a story that almost vanished from American history, a true account of courage, silence, and recognition long denied. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from. Turn up the volume and step with me into history. The box sat untouched for 78 years. Faded brown cardboard, military issue, tucked away in a government warehouse in Washington District of Columbia, filed and forgotten among countless other records from World War II. Inside, flight logs, mission reports, and photographs. Each piece of paper told fragments of an extraordinary story. A story the military establishment seemed determined to bury. March 19th, 1945. The skies over Berlin were defended by the most sophisticated anti-aircraft systems in Europe. The Luftwaffe, German Air Force, considered their capital impenetrable. They were wrong. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. studied the map spread across the briefing table. His eyes revealed nothing, but his mind calculated every risk, every possibility, every consequence. "Gentlemen," he addressed the pilots seated before him, "we fly tomorrow. Berlin, maximum effort." A heavy silence fell across the room. Captain Isaiah Munro glanced at his fellow airmen. Black faces in a segregated military. The 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen. "They say we can't do it," Munro wrote later that night in his personal journal. "They've been saying we can't do anything since we first put on the uniform. Tomorrow we fly to Berlin. Tomorrow we make history, or we don't come back at all." The United States Army Air Forces had reluctantly formed the all-black fighter group after intense political pressure. The military establishment predicted failure. Many hoped for it. Lieutenant General Frank O'Donnell, head of Fighter Command in the European theater, had opposed their deployment from the beginning. The Negro lacks the reflexes, courage, and intelligence required for modern aerial combat. Read his confidential memo dated January 12, 1943. "Their presence will endanger our strategic air campaign." This document, declassified only in 1995, reveals the institutional barriers the Tuskegee Airmen faced before they ever reached the battlefield. Dawn broke cold and clear on March 20, 1945. 63 P-51 Mustangs with distinctive red tails stood on the runway at Ramitelli Airfield in Italy. Each aircraft represented years of struggle. Each pilot had overcome obstacles beyond the imagination of their white counterparts. First, Lieutenant Robert Jenkins performed his final checks. The son of a Harlem postal worker, Jenkins had graduated top of his class at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. His application to flight school had been lost 3 times before finally being processed. "I was never fighting one war," he told his grandson decades later. "I was fighting 2, one against Hitler, one against my own country's prejudice." The mission was classified maximum priority: escort the heavy bombers, Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses, to Berlin. Protect them during the bombing run and bring them home. Intelligence reported over 100 enemy fighters would rise to meet them. Colonel Davis's voice crackled over the radio. "Red tails, this is leader. Remember who we are. Remember why we fly. Wheels up in 3 minutes." One by one, the Mustangs roared down the runway. The earth trembled. The air cracked. History shifted its course. First, Lieutenant William Morris watched the Italian countryside fall away beneath his wings. 3 years earlier, he had been a college student in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, he flew toward the heart of Nazi Germany. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Back home, I couldn't eat at a lunch counter," he wrote in a letter to his brother. "Here I am, trusted with a $5,000 airplane and the lives of white bomber crews." At 20,000 feet, the formation met the bombers. 500 Flying Fortresses, a metal armada bound for Berlin. The sight never failed to awe even the most experienced pilots. "Red tails, this is Brass Eagle," came the voice of the bomber commander. Glad to have you with us." It was an unprecedented acknowledgement. Earlier in the war, white bomber crews had complained about being assigned colored fighter escorts. Now they specifically requested the red tails. The reason was simple and undeniable. The Tuskegee Airmen never left their bombers. The German High Command had noticed. Classified Luftwaffe intelligence documents recovered after the war revealed growing concern about the Schwarze Vogelmenschen, black birdmen. "They fight with unexpected aggression and skill," wrote General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's fighter chief. "When the bombers have red-tailed escorts, our losses increase by 40%. Captain Monroe spotted them first, tiny black specks rising from airfields around Berlin. Messerschmitt 109 fighters and Focke-Wulf 190 interceptors. Germany's elite squadrons scrambling to defend their capital. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high," he radioed, "at least 60 plus. Colonel Davis's orders were calm, measured. Stay with the bombers. That's our job. That's why we're here." But the German fighters had other plans. They attacked in waves, diving through the bomber formation, guns blazing. The sky filled with tracers, smoke, and falling aircraft. Lieutenant Jenkins rolled his Mustang into a steep climb, pursuing a Messerschmitt that had damaged a bomber's right wing. The German pilot, likely a veteran of the Eastern Front, executed a series of defensive maneuvers that would have shaken most pursuers. Jenkins stayed with him, closing the distance. His 650 caliber machine guns erupted. The Messerschmitt's cockpit shattered. Another victory for a pilot who wasn't supposed to have the reflexes or intelligence for aerial combat. Below them, Berlin burned as the bombers delivered their payload. The mission was succeeding, but the battle had only begun. Lieutenant Morris found himself alone, separated from his squadron, surrounded by enemy fighters. His oxygen system damaged, his radio silent. He faced a pilot's worst nightmare. What happened next would remain buried in classified files for decades. If this story has moved you so far, leave a like and a comment. Each gesture helps keep these forgotten voices alive. Now let's return to the battlefield. General Erhard Milch, State Secretary in the German Air Ministry, was hosting a luncheon for Hitler's staff when the air raid sirens began wailing. "Impossible!" he declared, setting down his fork. No Allied aircraft could reach Berlin with enough fighter protection. He was wrong. The Tuskegee Airmen had arrived. Deep in the Reich Chancellery bunker, an aide handed Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, an urgent message. Allied bombers were over Berlin, protected by fighters with distinctive red tails. According to post-war testimony from his adjutant, Göring crumpled the paper and whispered, "The Americans are using their colored pilots. They must be desperate." His dismissive attitude would prove catastrophic. Lieutenant Morris, alone and surrounded, made a decision. Instead of attempting to escape, he attacked. Diving directly into a formation of 7 Messerschmitts, he scattered them with a burst of machine gun fire. In the confusion, he shot down 2 enemy aircraft before finding his way back to the bomber stream. His actions saved a damaged B-17 and its 10-man crew. "I wasn't thinking about being a hero," he later told investigators. "I was thinking about those boys in the bomber. They had mothers too." The Military Intelligence Service recorded his statement, but classified it. The white bomber crew he saved was told their rescuer was an unidentified fighter pilot. Meanwhile, Captain Monroe led his squadron against the second wave of German interceptors. The sky over Berlin became a swirling chaos of metal, fire, and falling men. "They came at us from every direction," wrote Technical Sergeant James Wilson, a bomber gunner. "But the red tails were everywhere. I've never seen such flying. They seemed to be without fear." Colonel Davis, monitoring the battle from his command Mustang, recognized a familiar tactic. The German fighters were attempting to lure the Tuskegee pilots away from the bombers. He wouldn't allow it. "Stay with the big friends," he ordered repeatedly. "That's our job." His discipline made the difference. While other fighter groups sometimes chased enemy aircraft to increase their personal score, the Tuskegee Airmen remained with their bombers, creating an aerial shield that the Luftwaffe could not penetrate. General Adolf Galland, watching the battle from his command center, made a fateful decision. He ordered every available fighter to engage the red-tailed Mustangs specifically. "Neutralize the black Americans first," his command stated, "then attack the bombers." It was perhaps the greatest, if unwitting, compliment the Tuskegee Airmen would receive during the war. The Germans recognized them as the primary threat. Lieutenant Robert Jenkins found himself the target of 3 Focke-Wulf 190s, Germany's most advanced fighter. Outgunned and outnumbered, he executed a series of maneuvers so complex that one of the pursuing pilots broke off rather than risk a collision. "I learned to fly in crop dusters back in Alabama," Jenkins explained years later. "When someone's trying to run you off their land with a shotgun, you learn to be creative." He shot down one of his pursuers and damaged another before rejoining the formation. As the bombing run concluded, Colonel Davis began the equally dangerous task of escorting the bombers home. The Luftwaffe, desperate to salvage a victory, pressed their attacks with increasing ferocity. It was during this phase that Captain Monroe's aircraft took a direct hit to the engine. Oil streamed across his canopy, blinding him. Smoke filled the cockpit. "Monroe to leader," he radioed calmly. "I'm hit. Can't see. Engine failing." Colonel Davis immediately dispatched Lieutenant Morris and Lieutenant Jenkins to escort Monroe. "Stay with him," Davis ordered. "Bring him home." What followed was an extraordinary feat of airmanship. Morris flew alongside Monroe's damaged Mustang, calling out directions and obstacles. Jenkins provided cover from enemy fighters attempting to finish off the wounded aircraft. For 97 minutes, they guided their blinded comrade across enemy territory through anti-aircraft fire and finally to the safety of Allied lines. "I never saw their faces," Captain Monroe said after his emergency landing, "but I knew their voices. I trusted them with my life." The mission to Berlin had succeeded against all predictions. The bombers had reached their targets and returned with minimal losses. The Tuskegee Airmen had destroyed 34 enemy aircraft confirmed, with 12 more probables. But the true significance of their achievement would be deliberately obscured. Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest III, reviewing the after-action reports, issued a confidential directive. While the performance of the 332nd deserves recognition, public emphasis on their success could create unrealistic expectations about Negro capabilities. Attribute the mission's success to overall Allied air superiority. The official press release mentioned the bombing of Berlin, but omitted any reference to the Tuskegee Airmen. The pilots returned to their segregated base, their achievement known only to themselves and the bomber crews they had protected. Lieutenant Jenkins sat on his bunk that night, writing in his journal, "Today we flew to Berlin. Today we made history, but I wonder if anyone will ever know." His words proved prophetic. The Berlin mission, one of the most significant achievements by black Americans during World War II, would remain largely unknown for decades. The following morning, Colonel Davis was summoned to Allied headquarters. He expected commendation. Instead, he received new orders. The 332nd would be assigned to coastal patrols, far from the strategic bombing campaign, far from the opportunity to continue proving their worth. "The reassignment is temporary," he was told, "until proper evaluation of yesterday's mission can be completed. That evaluation would take 50 years. Summer 1992. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a historian specializing in African American military contributions, was researching an unrelated topic when she discovered a misfiled box in the National Archives. Inside were the original flight logs, mission reports, and combat assessments from the Berlin raid. Among them, a document that had never been entered into the official record. "Assessment of Berlin Operation March 20th, 1945, it began. The success of today's mission can be attributed primarily to the extraordinary performance of the 332nd Fighter Group. Their tactical discipline, combat effectiveness, and willingness to engage superior enemy forces made the difference between success and failure. The report was signed by Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force. It had been suppressed for nearly half a century. Dr. Carter's discovery began a re-examination of the Tuskegee Airmen's contributions to the Allied victory. Military historians, initially skeptical, were forced to acknowledge that these black pilots had achieved one of the most significant aerial victories of the European campaign. Berlin, the Nazi capital, the heart of Hitler's Germany, defended by their best pilots and most sophisticated anti-aircraft systems, penetrated by bombers, protected by men who couldn't enter a whites-only restaurant back home. The irony was profound. Retired Colonel Harold Wright, a former bomber pilot, came forward after reading about Dr. Carter's discovery. "We called them our red-tail angels," he said in a recorded interview. "When we saw those red tails pull alongside, we knew we had a fighting chance. They never left us. Not once, not even over Berlin." More testimonials followed, more evidence emerged. The true story of the Tuskegee Airmen and their Berlin mission began to take shape after decades of institutional silence. In August 1995, a memorial ceremony was held at Arlington National Cemetery. Only 12 of the original Berlin mission pilots were still alive to attend. Captain Isaiah Monroe, now 93 years old, sat in his wheelchair as the Air Force Chief of Staff read the long-delayed citation. For extraordinary heroism in military operations against an armed enemy of the United States on March 20th, 1945. The gallantry, determination, and esprit de corps displayed by the officers and enlisted members of the 332nd Fighter Group in the face of extremely dangerous and difficult conditions materially aided in the successful bombing of vital industrial targets in Berlin, dealing a severe blow to the enemy's ability to wage war. Monroe listened, his weathered face impassive. When asked how he felt about the belated recognition, he replied simply, "I didn't fight for medals. I fought for my country and for those boys in the bombers, and for the day when no American would be judged by the color of their skin." Lieutenant Robert Jenkins, who had survived both the war and the decades of silence that followed, stood straighter as the citation was read. His grandson, now an Air Force captain himself, stood beside him in uniform. "My grandfather never spoke much about the war," Captain Michael Jenkins told reporters, "but he kept his pilot's wings on his bedside table every night of his life. Now I know why." After the ceremony, the surviving airmen gathered privately to remember those who hadn't lived to see this day. "We flew to Berlin," Monroe reminded them, echoing the words from his long-ago journal. "We made history." And finally, history remembered. In 2007, the Tuskegee Airmen received the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian award bestowed by the United States Congress. President George W. Bush presented the medal collectively to the approximately 300 surviving airmen. "The Tuskegee Airmen helped win a war," the president said, "and change our nation for the better." But even at this moment of national recognition, few Americans knew the full story of the Berlin mission, how Hitler's generals tried to hide when the black Tuskegee Airmen crushed their air defenses over the Nazi capital. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe fighter chief who had ordered his forces to target the Red Tails specifically, survived the war and later became an aviation consultant. In 1971, he was interviewed by a German aviation magazine about the final months of the air war. "The Americans had many excellent fighter pilots," he said, "but none more determined than those with the red tails. When they appeared over Berlin, we knew the war was truly lost." His admission, like so many truths about the Tuskegee Airmen, remained obscured for decades. The pilots themselves rarely sought publicity or recognition. They had fought for a freedom they did not fully enjoy at home. Many returned to an America still deeply segregated, still resistant to acknowledging their contribution. Lieutenant William Morris, who had helped guide Captain Monroe's blinded aircraft to safety, came home to find he could not be served at the same restaurants as the white airmen he had protected over Berlin. "The enemy never asked what color I was," he observed dryly. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had led the Berlin mission, continued his military career despite the persistent barriers of racism. In 1998, President Bill Clinton promoted the retired Davis to 4-star general, acknowledging a rank long deserved but previously denied. The box that Dr. Elizabeth Carter discovered in 1992 contained more than just military documents. It held personal letters, photographs, and the individual stories of men who changed history while history tried to ignore them. Among these was a yellowed page from Captain Monroe's journal, dated March 21, 1945, the day after the Berlin mission. "Yesterday we proved what we've always known," he wrote, "that courage has no color, that skill has no race, that loyalty has no creed. We flew to the heart of the enemy and returned. History may forget us, but the sky remembers. The sky remembers. And now so do we. These names were almost erased, but history remembers those who refuse to be silent. If you believe their stories deserve to be told, support this channel. Like, comment, and subscribe. See you in the next episode.